Good morning. This is Craig Spiesel with the Online Trust Alliance. I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today, which is focused on email authentication best practices, and will provide a reality check on the progress. A few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded and posted at the end of the day along with the presentation on our site at the address shown here on the screen. The second point is that we will be taking questions. Encourage you to use the question pane at the bottom of this page. We'll be taking questions at the end of the day or end of the session here, so encourage those feedback. So with no further ado, I'd like to kind of get started and welcome our panel. And we're very fortunate today to have a panel of experts, who's who in the development of email authentication from the early inception over a decade ago to today, and we're realizing significant benefits and achievements across all sectors. So I want to welcome Mike Jones from Agari, Robert Holmes from Path, Alex Garcia-Tobar from ValiMail, and Jeff Wilbur from Iconics, and also a VP of Research for the Online Trust Alliance. So with that, I'd like to kind of turn it over to Jeff and to kind of kick off the webinar today. Jeff?
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. As you know from the title, we've drawn this material from our annual online trust audit, but it still begs the question, why should we care about this email deep dive? And it doesn't take much to look around the headlines these days to find good reasons to care. The Anti-Phishing Working Group just reported last month that first quarter of this year was the highest number of phishing sites they'd ever seen since 2004. And it grew by 250% over a previous quarter. So phishing is up. Phishing is also kind of morphed into a more precise and varied attack vector for the bad guys. A couple headlines here. The bottom one talks about scamming for email with these, or for dollars with the business email compromise, where it doesn't even take malware and stealing of credentials anymore. You can send a message pretending to be from a CEO or CFO asking for a wire transfer, and suddenly the money is transferred by the unsuspecting recipient of the message. And the middle one there with Grand Ole Opry and Sprouts is the W-2 attack. So a similar request from theoretically an executive asking for W-2 information for all the employees. Again, not even any malware or stealing of credentials. So the social engineering aspect has gone through the roof here, and not necessarily technically precise. And then we hear year after year that this is fake email messages are the entry point for more than 90% of breaches overall. So it's a serious issue, actually having become more serious over the last few years. So looking at just an overview of what we did in the honor roll, just to kind of set some context of where this data came from, we looked at about 1,000 websites in several sectors, the top 500 retailers, excuse me, top 100 banks, and so forth down the line. We looked at 3 separate areas: consumer protection, security, and privacy. Today we're just focused on consumer protection, which is largely defined by email authentication. And we assigned points, and you had to score a certain number of points to make the honor roll. We're not really going to look at that data as much today. We're going to look kind of down inside that consumer protection circle. So overall, we also, besides tracking who makes an honor roll, which is kind of like the AB honor roll in school, we also look at who fails what category. And overall, on these 1,000 websites, consumer protection was by far the #1 reason for failure. It varied by sector, but over a quarter of the sites failed because they had inadequate email authentication. And at a top level, if you had to pick one thing, the way we score this, lack of DKIM at the site's top level domain was the reason, but we're going to peel way more into that as we look at this. So what do we look for in consumer protection itself? There are 100 baseline points available, and then bonus and penalty, and we're going to really focus just on the baseline points for our analysis today. So that's in the gray. We want to see SPF and DKIM, the 2 primary email authentication methods, at the top level and any subdomains used for email. We also want to see a DMARC record and a policy assertion of reject or quarantine. Now, year over year, we kind of shift the weighting here, and as new best practices come into play, they move from the bonus point area into the baseline and then eventually become a penalty if you don't do it. So the italics represent the shifts from year to year. So we did increase the weight for the top-level domain support this year, and we also increased the weight for setting a reject policy with DMARC. So very quickly, don't know what level of knowledge people have on the phone, but email authentication, there's kind of two major methods. I already mentioned SPF and DKIM. SPF looks at the path. You can post on your DNS. These are the addresses I send from. The recipient can say, did it come from one of those addresses? Therefore, it is from that sender. DKIM, you sign the message, and when you receive it, you can use a key to make sure that it hasn't been altered in transit, so it's protecting kind of the message itself. They both kind of have blind spots for various reasons, forwarding and other things, and so using them both in conjunction with each other is the best, most resilient way to do it, and that's why we kind of weight it where we want to see both in action. And then DMARC leverages the existence of both SPF and DKIM to allow the sender to do some extra things. So they can get reports back on whether their authentication is acting properly. So major receivers like the Gmails and Yahoo Mails and Outlooks of the world can send back reports, as well as many other sites. You can also assert a policy and say, if my messages fail authentication, I want you to quarantine them. I want you to reject them. That's what we were talking about earlier in the assessment. And so we're going to peel into this a lot more, but DMARC kind of sits on top of those two, and it's used to give them a lot more value. So there's a lot of data here, but just want to walk through. We've been tracking email authentication adoption now for about 8 years, just showing the last 4 years here. And kind of the legend on the right walks through the lines in the same order that they are from top to bottom. So if you look at the top, and here we track whether you have SPF or DKIM at the top level domain or any subdomains that we are aware of. So that trend is looking pretty good. You're up in the 90% range even 4 years ago, and now you're up in the high 90s overall average this year. That looks like great support. Do you have support for SPF at any level? That's the orange line. It's almost as high. The gray line is SPF at the top level domain. So you're protecting your primary corporate domain, or the one that people know you by for your website. That's been in the 70s, and it's risen to about 80%, just short of 80% this year. That's pretty solid. The next one down is any DKIM. That means at a subdomain or a top-level domain. The next one is you have both SPF and DKIM, either at top level or subdomains. You look at that chunk of lines and you say, this is looking pretty good. It's in this year, 2016, 80 to 95% problem solved, right? Well, look a little further down and you see that DKIM at the top level domain, so protecting the main one that bad guys would use to represent you, is actually down in the 40s. It started a few years ago in the low 20s. And those having a DMARC record to assert just a DMARC record, not even a policy necessarily to assert what to do with failed messages, is only in the 20s. So we have some missing authentication there, and we're going to talk more about that. If we look at it by sector, SPF at the top level, you kind of saw where it is overall this year. It's fairly well clustered between roughly 80 and 90%. DKIM is down in the 30s for most sectors. The federal government is the laggard there, and the consumer sites like your social sites and file and photo sharing sites and so forth are the highest. Having SPF and DKIM at the level, it drops it down even a little bit more for most of the sectors. DMARC record is the next chunk there, and you can see that it's down in the 20s for most of the sectors. Again, consumer is by far the leader there. And so when you start to filter it out by true best practices, SPF and DKIM at the top level domain with a DMARC record, the numbers just continue to come down more and more. And this is really the reality check. We looked at, does a site have SPF and DKIM at the top level domain, the one that bad guys would use most often for spear phishing or phishing? And do they have a DMARC record with some kind of policy assertions that if the messages get quarantined or rejected? And you go from those 80–90% levels down to single digits. So the retailers are down in the 2–3% range. Banks are at 5%. Consumer is by far the leader, but it's only 16%, and so forth. And the overall across the 1,000 sites is only 4%. And so this is really where rubber meets the road on protecting your top-level brand, so to speak, with your email. This is really where we want to focus because there's a huge gap here. There's this common perception that email authentication's kind of been dealt with, taken care of with those 80–90% adoption levels, but when you look at the reality, we're actually down in the single digits. If we look at the brands and icons of who actually achieve those, this is on the left is the retailers, the top middle is the banks, below them the government sites, on the top right are all the consumer sites that represented that 16%. And then the news and media sites are the ones represented on the bottom there. So you can see who's kind of doing a good job protecting their brand with that requirement of both SPF and DKIM at the TLD and a DMARC record with a policy assertion. And this is where we really want everybody to be over time. So now we want to kind of go into some slides about discussing these issues and kind of what gets in the way, and then kind of look at common mistakes, and then how can we overcome those. So to kick this off, I want to get the panelists involved here. These are kind of the 4 major stumbling blocks we came up with as we talked through this. And Mike Jones from Agari, if you can address that first one. Many companies aren't aware of what the value of this stuff is.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. So when I think about this problem of businesses not being aware of the value of authentication and DMARC, I think 2 levels of awareness. At the first basic level, DMARC as a specification is relatively new as an email specification. It's only been around for a few years now. So there is a bit of an education process, just making people aware that there exists now a mechanism where you, as a brand owner, as a domain owner, can express a policy that tells the internet how you want your domain and your brand to be used in email. And before DMARC, there was never really a widespread, well-accepted mechanism to do that. So a lot of even email people, for a long time, it takes some education and time to make sure that the newness of that specification gets out there. The next level on awareness of value that I think we need to start getting businesses to think about is DMARC makes it possible now to view email security from a different perspective. Like traditionally, email security has always been focused on kind of incident management and incident response. Like I saw an attack, I saw a phishing message, and I blocked it or I quarantined it, and you're always responding to an incident. But what DMARC actually does is it allows businesses to look at email from a different perspective of managing the risk that email poses to my brand or my organization. And I think that's a huge value of DMARC that not all businesses recognize, because now you can just use the visibility of DMARC to say, hey, I have the third parties that send email on behalf of my brand are out of control, and this poses a risk to my business and my brand because there's too many unknown sources of email for me, and I want to manage that and apply some new governance policies to that. So I think that's a huge value to DMARC and authentication that not all businesses think about initially, and we need to do a better job of educating the industries about that.
Great, thanks. And we're definitely going to talk more about that value as we go through these next few slides. Alex, can you kind of cover the next one about risk tolerance and how that's a stumbling block?
Sure, thank you, Jeff. So when I think about putting myself in the shoes of those that have to implement DMARC or email authentication, you're talking about people who are responsible for making sure that email works and that email is secure. And because email authentication is binary, you either are enforcing it or you're not, what ends up happening is after a monitoring period, you need to pull the trigger. You need to go to enforcement. And the fear of getting this wrong, i.e., I'm going to block good email, maybe that email that my CEO is sending out to the legal team for an acquisition, versus the risk of getting phished, is a real balance for these people. And so the fear of getting it wrong sometimes outweighs the benefit of getting it right. And so the risk tolerance in this situation is you go through a monitoring phase of DMARC, and you see with your 20% adoption rate that you had, Jeff, earlier, but only 4% are actually in enforcement on average. What you end up with is you have this fear of actually going into enforcement. And fortunately, we have vendors such as the panelists here, ourselves, etc., that can help people through that process. But there is a real concern inside an organization of, oh God, if I go to enforcement, am I going to bring the company's email systems down? And so that is a real issue in trying to get to that enforcement stage where you're now declaratively stating to the outside world to start either quarantining or rejecting messages that don't fit within the authentication whitelist that you've created. And of course, that's great if you've done it right, because you're going to stop phishing attacks and people who are not authorized to use your domain for email. But on the negative side, if you get it wrong, good email is going to get blocked as well.
Yeah, that certainly can be a concern, and we're going to talk more about that when next few slides when we talk about common mistakes and kind of how to overcome those. So this next one is interesting. Our analysis this year, we looked at top-level domains and then subdomains, as I said, and most of those subdomains were marketing-oriented subdomains. They tended to have very strong practices, subdomain level, usually because it's delegated out to someone who's a professional, email service provider of some kind. But those top-level domains are usually owned and managed by others, like the IT department themselves. So we kind of see there might be a disconnect within the organization. So Robert, maybe you can kind of comment about that and what you see out there in terms of how organizations can look across all their email to solve these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think that in terms of disconnects and lack of ownership, we see this at two stages of the project. One is at the very initiation. Whose problem is this? Is this a security problem? Is it a messaging problem? Is it actually something that needs to be looked after by the people who are sending mail, the marketing departments, for example? So I think that the first challenge that organizations face is whose problem is this? The second area of kind of disconnect is on the implementation. The reality of it is that per Alex's input there on the risk tolerance side, if you get this wrong, things can go really bad very quickly in terms of blocking legitimate email. So you've really got to get that right. The challenge is, in the first place, discovery who is sending on your behalf, and as an extension of that, which of those senders are legitimate, are authorized to send on your behalf, and which are not. And then actually, and when you're considering multiple departments internally and multiple third parties who may be sending on your behalf, aligning their messaging systems, aligning their DNS administrators, and coordinating that project in such a way that that kind of multifaceted group of stakeholders can actually marginalize the risk to the point where you can, with confidence, announce a block policy without incurring the risk of blocking legitimate email. So this is a very, very big problem. In the first place, who is the single owner of that? Where you have joint ownership, a project will fail generally. But then the second thing is actually then getting the people together and project managing it. Because let's be honest, most organizations do not have an email authentication team. So those are, I'll give you one crisp example from the other day. Financial institution, they have a gating factor to getting their top level domain to reject, which is that they require, there's a mail stream that is sent by an automated system. And the IT department were not involved in the original project initiation stage. And they have policies, IT policies that they need to adhere to, and nothing requires them to honor DMARC, nothing requires them to implement DKIM. And so we have these little fiefdoms that we then need to break down and get a potentially large international company all aligned behind the end goal, and collaborating to get them there. So that's a flavor of the kind of challenges that we see.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example. And then finally, there's that, you've all kind of mentioned implementation can be an issue, and that really kind of comes down to technical knowledge of doing it right. And so I know there are a lot of resources out there from all of your companies have them, OTA, we have, our site has a number of resources that points to you guys and others. DMARC.org has a number of resources out there. So the knowledge is out there, but again, when you combine it with these other stumbling blocks of the risk tolerance and awareness of value, it can still get in the way. It's just kind of an intimidation factor. I would be interested in hearing from each of you just real quickly, of the 4 stumbling blocks that are on this list, which one, I know they all come into play depending on the account and so forth, but if you had to pick one that gets in the way the most, Mike, maybe you can start, and then Alex, and then Robert, which one you think is kind of the most critical that you see?
It's a little hard to say which one's the most critical, because I think it's almost like in order. There are different stumbling blocks that hit at different stages. So, I mean, first of all, the lack of awareness hits first, because you need to have the awareness of the value and such to even start on the project. Then after that, you generally run into the organizational disconnects and ownership to see, like, if it's a complex organization, who's going to own this and be responsible for rolling out the project. Then you kind of get into the technical knowledge of implementation, and then into the once you've gone through some of the implementation and you have your policies out there, then it's a question of risk tolerance. Like, am I able to take the next step? So I don't know that there's one that you hit. I don't know if I can rank it that way, because it's almost like an ordered progress, and you have to overcome a stumbling block at each stage. Sorry, that's a little going around the question, but.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Mike. I think that there are ways of kind of breaking the cycle by finding somebody who's going to own it and then drive awareness so that you can try and restructure the chain, if you like. But I generally agree that the first thing is actually people in many cases don't know what they can achieve.
Alex, how about you?
Yeah, so I would agree that it is sequential, but to both Robert as well as Mike's points, the lack of awareness of value to me is tantamount. It's the most important issue. None of these other issues get solved unless there's an awareness that there's a solution. And when you read the breaches, I can't tell you how many times I've read about a breach, and it ends with vigilance, with people being able to detect whether whether an email is real or not, etc. Never mentions email authentication at all. And so I think there's a failure in just awareness in both the organizations, ourselves, etc., and being able to get that message out. It's people like OTA and seminars like this that I think are making a difference. But until I read in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, in whichever publication that releases the latest breach, and it says you should authenticate your email as one of the ways to reduce phishing, I don't think that we've done enough to bring the awareness level to a point at which these other issues become the issue.
Great point. Well, we'd like to move on now to, we kind of collected from everyone a list of common mistakes and issues that they run into, and we're going to kind of walk through these. This is by no means intended to be a training session, a deep dive on the actual technical implementation, but we do want to, at a top level at least, cover some of these issues that are common mistakes that people run into. So the first one, Robert, maybe you can comment on very quickly, is just the idea of incomplete authentication that you see out there, of not specifics related to SPF or DKIM in particular, but just in general that people aren't authenticating everything they should.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy that I give, Jeff, is kind of operating email gateways or email filtering without authentication is like operating border control without passports. It can be done, but it is really cumbersome and prone to error. So I would generally make the statement that the mailbox providers face a really, really tough challenge. Not just the mailbox provider community, but also the secure email gateway community. They face a really hard challenge. And where there is patchy implementation of authentication means that they cannot rely on authentication as a strong indicator as to whether something is good or bad. And I don't think I'll belabor that point because I think we're going to go into some of the details, the technical details. But lack of consistent and complete adoption of authentication means that the community cannot benefit from the overarching value that authentication can bring to the community.
Great, that's a great analogy as well. So let's move on to kind of particular issues related to SPF. And Mike, maybe you can cover kind of that's an SPF record there out on the right from Agari themselves, and maybe you can cover that in the first couple points on the bullets there.
Yeah, you bet. So yeah, the SPF record pictured here is the SPF record for our own domain, agari.com, and I'll actually talk about at least the first two bullets here in the context of our own record. So the first common mistake listed here is overly broad references in an SPF record. And what that means is, the purpose of an SPF record is to specify the sources of email, the IP addresses of servers that are allowed to send email for your domain or with your domain in the envelope. And in order for an SPF record to be effective as a security measure, you don't want to specify that the entire internet can send email for your domain. You want that specification of the servers to be fairly narrow and cover just the servers that you really want to authorize to send email. Unfortunately, there's some pretty well-known examples out there where this isn't the case. There's one well-known brand that for years has published a /8 network in their SPF record, so that authorizes close to 17 million IP addresses to send on their domain's behalf, which is somewhat ridiculous. There's not 17 million email servers actually sending email for that brand. So this isn't a technical mistake in a record, but it's not a good practice. In our own record, you see we have an include for spf.google.com. So we use Google Apps for our own email, so we include the Google SPF record that they recommend. The problem with that is Google has some very, very large IPv6 networks that are authorized in that record. So that in turn propagates to our record and ends up authorizing a number of IP addresses, IPv6 addresses to send mail that the number is so large I don't even know how to say the number actually. It's because the IPv6 networks tend to get so large. So again, it's not the best practice. The record should specify more narrowly the set of servers that you actually believe are going to send email. The next bullet is exceeding the limit of 10 DNS queries. This actually is part of the specification. If you have a mechanism like you see the include mechanisms in here, there's a couple of mechanisms that require a DNS lookup while you're evaluating the record. If you have more than 10 of those in a record, then that's a violation of the spec. And that when an organization has a lot of third parties that send, for example, you could end up with a lot of DNS queries that cause your record to exceed that limit. So in our own record, you can see 4 mechanisms right there in the base record. But again, using Google as an example, if you actually expand that include for Google, you would see that their record has 3 other nested includes in it. So those actually count towards the limit. So our record doesn't exceed the query limit right now, but it is at 8 DNS lookups. So it's very common for SPF records to get close to that 10 DNS lookup, query lookup, or exceed it.
Right. Alex, maybe you can comment on the next couple bullets there, the typos and the use of the various syntax for the all at the end of the record.
Sure, I can. Thank you, Jeff. So this is true for everything that we're going to talk about in terms of both the SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records. These records reside within DNS. DNS is an older technology that is based on text input, and because of that, just one spacing error, just one colon, one misplaced character can actually mess up your entire record. And the problem is not only that it's error prone and manual in terms of its input for the most part, but also the fact that there is no immediate feedback mechanism available in DNS. So you don't know you got it wrong right away. And so this is a very common thing for people to get wrong because the specifications are complex, and there really is a lot of information out there, not all of it necessarily correct. So that's the first thing I'd like to say about typos or syntax errors. The second thing I can say about typos and syntax errors is that we believe that being able to manage some of this on behalf of clients is an increasingly important aspect to providing a service to the various senders that adopt DMARC. And this could be one important reason why you turn this over to the quote-unquote experts. Then the second bullet, which is the use of it's question mark all or plus all, I'm going to focus on the second one because the second one is the problematic one. So SPF allows you to either do a hard, a soft, or an include all, and this plus all means to include everything. So if you put a plus all in your SPF record, you're essentially saying that anyone can send on my behalf. The whole point of DMARC is to reduce the list of people who can send on your behalf to yourself and email services that send on your behalf, like Salesforce or Marketo or Google or whoever else you may have that might be sending on your behalf. So by putting a plus all to an SPF record, you're essentially saying, ignore me, ignore all of my rule sets, allow everyone to send on my behalf, which essentially destroys the value that you're trying to create here.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Just a quick data point. We actually saw at the top level 4 sites of those 1,000 that had a plus all record. So they're saying anyone can send on my behalf. So they're wide open for phishing attacks. And then we did see about, yeah, go ahead.
So, sorry, I was going to say, it's funny you say that. It does make the SPF record add everybody that you could possibly imagine. So you avoid that risk tolerance of rejecting a good email by accident, but of course you're allowing everyone, including the phishers, to send on your behalf.
Yeah, and for the question mark all, that's kind of a test mode, and I guess the reality is, does the recipient take it seriously or not when it's there? Do they ignore it or do they actually look at it? But we did see roughly 3% of the sites had those. Most of them were in the retailer area. That's not a good practice. I know it may not be a hard error, but you really should be at the tilde all or the dash all, which is the soft and hard fail that you mentioned up front. So Robert, maybe you can take the next couple points there about the records.
Sure. I mean, I'll kind of echo something which Mike said earlier. You know, when you may have limitations on the number of includes that you can have in an SPF record, you really want to make sure that you don't have any wasted slots, as it were. So I'm going to allude to kind of 2 reasons why you wouldn't want missing or ambiguous records. One is because of the fact that they're a waste of valuable slots, up to 10, remember. But then the second thing could be more severe. And the more severe possibility is that a mailbox provider, a receiver of email, runs the query, is unable to resolve it to a legitimate IP space, and will then potentially ignore the SPF record or not know how to handle it, and you start then losing control. So I think that having good hygiene of your records and making sure that everything is up to date is really important. And there are legitimate reasons why why includes can get orphaned. So for example, if you change your email service provider, you may, or if that email service provider gets acquired and moves to a new IP space, that IP space may be abandoned. And so, good hygiene says keep on top of that. In terms of good hygiene, I mean, it's a simple one, but don't confuse the mailbox providers. If they are running queries and they don't know which SPF record to query, maybe they will hit the right one, maybe they will not, maybe they will actually slam you for not having good SPF hygiene. So bear in mind the mailbox providers are doing a tough job here, and it has to be as automated as possible. They don't like having to handle exceptions. Exceptions, therefore, they are at risk of being handled in a somewhat draconian manner.
Great, good points there. And Mike, can you take that last one about SPF at top level versus subdomains?
Sure. This is, I don't think this is the most common mistake, but it's just something to be aware of, that when you publish an SPF record, so for example, the Agari.com SPF record you see there, it only applies to that domain. It does not propagate down to subdomains. And this is different behavior than a DMARC record, for example, so that can cause some confusion. So a DMARC record published at the top level domain actually propagates down to subdomains unless you specify that it should not. Whereas with SPF record, if I want mail.agari.com to have an SPF record, I have to explicitly publish that record as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it requires a little more diligence and oversight to make sure you're covering every subdomain you send email from. So let's move on to DKIM, the next section here. And Alex, maybe you can kick off the kind of the record itself and those first couple points about truncated records and key management.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. So the DKIM record is a relatively complex one because in addition to getting the actual specifications correct, you also have to get the key correct. And the key, cryptographic keys, as people mostly know, are just a string of gibberish, generally slightly over 1,000 characters in some cases, and if you have a stronger one, over 2,000 characters. And so what you end up with is it's impossible for a human to know whether the key is perfectly correct or not. As a matter of fact, Google has told us that over 20% of the keys they look at are in fact missing a character, have an extra character or a space, etc. Sometimes a carriage return, etc., etc. And so if you actually publish the DKIM record here, and you'll see the ... at the end, this record would be quite lengthy. It wouldn't fit on the side, the little side note here would take up the entire slide. So you can actually see how this whole getting things wrong easily takes effect, especially with DKIM. And again, because you're working in DNS, everything's text-based, very error-prone, and no immediate feedback mechanism to tell you that you got it right. So that's essentially the high level on the truncated DKIM records of bad characters in the key. The second piece is DKIM is very different than some of these other specifications in that everyone knows that a weak key can be compromised if it's left out there for too long, and even stronger keys can be compromised. And so it's really incumbent upon the sender or the owner of the key to manage that key effectively. And what that really means is the ability to rotate the key on a fixed basis, usually something around 2 to 3 times a year, and to make sure that each service and each service has its own key, etc. Then the final one is you need to store some of these keys in ways that keep them secure. And not all third-party senders do that very effectively. You have the email solution providers. These are people that send marketing messages on your behalf that use sometimes the same key for many, many years and the same key across all of their clients. And so what you end up with is even if your hygiene on DKIM key management is correct, the services you use may or may not use extremely up-to-date or good hygiene with their DKIM keys. And what this really brings together is that PKI is still not, even in 2016, is still not an easy thing to do, and especially not an easy thing to do correctly and securely. So we do see a lot of times that there are missing DKIM keys. We see that DKIM keys are old and therefore not secure. And we see that the key lengths sometimes are way too short. And so, you know, nowadays, something like a 1024 or 2048 is even better. Those are the type length keys that you want to start looking at. Indeed, Google forced people into the 1024 a while back and is now getting ready to force people now into the higher tier of the 2048. So those are some of the items around key management. This is frankly a whole, it could be a whole seminar on DKIM that we could go into, Jeff, but I'll leave it at that in the interest of time and happy to take questions at the end.
Great. Robert, maybe you can take the next one of just where you are in the mail flow and how the signing might affect that.
Yeah, sure. I think the important thing to realize is that there are two kind of key ingredients of DKIM. One is that it declares what domain signed for the email, and that you can trust that that domain really did sign for that email. That's the DKIM D equals tag. And then the second thing is that DKIM enables you to trust that the email was not altered, that it is exactly as it was when it was sent. So no alteration in transit. The challenge becomes if you sign with DKIM before you hit your external MTA, and then after you have signed with DKIM, it goes through some process that maybe it's an antivirus filter that just makes sure that there, this email has been screened by Message Labs or what have you. And if that content is written into the footer of the email or the head or the top of the email, then that has actually altered the content of the email such that the DKIM signature could break. So it is important that you are signing DKIM as close to the boundary as possible. So that's what I would say on that.
Great. And Mike, can you take that last one?
Sure. So it's pretty common practice if you're using an email service provider or some kind of infrastructure provider to send out email that in addition to your own DKIM signature where you are the signing domain, that the provider adds their own DKIM signature with their own domain identifier as the signing domain. So that's not uncommon, and it's also not prohibited by DKIM. That's perfectly acceptable. This is more of a troubleshooting tip, I guess, because I have seen incidents where the receiving system actually doesn't do the right thing and interpret or evaluate both signatures. They may only evaluate the first signature they find, or in the context of a DMARC evaluation, instead of looking at both signatures and choosing the one that aligns with the DMARC domain, to do the DMARC evaluation, they pick the wrong signature for the DMARC evaluation, so you end up with an alignment failure. So it's really not a problem with DKIM as so much as a troubleshooting thing to look at if you're seeing failures on the receiving system.
Great, and that leads us perfectly into the next slide here, which is common mistakes related to DMARC. And the good news is you guys articulated a bunch of I was a little bit intimidated coming out of that last slide. There's so many ways you can cause errors, but the good news is with the reports you get back from DMARC, you can kind of see what's happening there and correct those. We do need to kind of go through these a little more quickly than we have been. So Robert, can you kind of kick off, talk about the DMARC record itself and some of the syntax errors that can happen?
Sure. I mean, I think the most important tags in a DMARC record are the policy, which dictates what a receiving entity should do in the event that an email fails, DMARC authentication, and that's denoted by P equals reject. And then you've got the reporting addresses in the example there of the returnpath.net reporting addresses. But the important thing to realize here is that it needs to be machine readable, and the machines are stupid, and they will interpret the record in the way that they are designed to do, and they won't suffer exceptions very well. So You need to make sure that you have semicolons for delimiters. We actually would recommend semicolon followed by a space for reasons that we don't have time to go into now. A common error is like the subdomain for the record is not DMARC, it's underscore DMARC. That's a common error. And whilst we'd like to talk about monitor-only mode, the policy, the P equals tag must be none for monitor-only rather than P equals monitor. But there are a whole host of syntax errors you've got to be aware of, and I'll leave it there.
Great. So Alex, can you take the next couple there?
Sure. So one thing to be aware of is that DMARC added both a policy layer, i.e. what I want you to do if a message fails authentication, as well as a feedback mechanism. And what that means, it's a critical part to getting things right. What that means is that if someone sends an email and claims to be, let's say, OTA, let's say it's sent to your Gmail. So Google receives it, holds it in a holding pen, so to speak, and goes to the OTA DNS. And they, in your case, because we're doing your information, they come to us. We provide a response essentially that says, hey, we would like you to provide feedback, to provide data on anyone at all that sends messages as OTA. And this comes in the form of two different types of reports. One is known as RUA, which are aggregate reports, and RUF, which are forensic reports. The first one is an aggregate amount of data that gets sent generally once a day by all senders. This is widely adopted by anyone enforcing DMARC. So it lets you know as OTA, these are all the different services across the world that either have legitimately or non-legitimately sent email claiming to be you. It is that information that allows you to fine-tune the whitelist during the initial monitoring phase that you go through in DMARC. The RUF provides near real-time data, which is forensic data, that gives you slightly more information about the exact email that may have failed the authentication. The issue with that is that it's not supported by many of the receivers. In fact, a very big one, Google, does not send out RUF. And so the way that at least we view this is that RUA feedback is absolutely critical to getting your DMARC whitelist correct before you go to enforcement. And so if you're going to publish a P equals none in your DMARC, but you're not going to receive feedback, it does very little for you. And then the RUF, for companies that want to focus on analytics, threat analytics, etc., that's additional information that allows you to get down into very specifics about the exact email that may or may not have correctly been sent or illegitimately sent on your behalf. And so the way that we view this is you must have RUA. RUF is optional depending on what you want to do with that information, but not having any RUA or RUF is absolutely a no-no, because you can't really figure out whether your emails are authenticating properly or not before you go to enforcement. Then the second piece is the inappropriate use of SP equals none. We talked about this a bit previously in the SPF section, but it reminds me of a recent prospect that we were talking to, and in this case, it's a company that had put a enforcement policy on their top level domain, which is great, but then had an SP none in their DMARC record. And what that means is that for all subdomains, there is no enforcement of email authentication, meaning that you can get attacked by anyone spoofing a subdomain of yours. So, I mean, just to take OTA's case, if you had an SP equals none in your DMARC record, it means that someone could send email as email.otaalliance or ota.com or .org, and those emails would go through fine, and so they could spoof you by using your subdomains. In the case of this prospect specifically, they only sent email through their subdomains, so essentially they left themselves wide open to attack, even though they thought they had covered themselves through having the top level being an enforcement. And this is a relatively common error that we see because there are some publications out there that recommend that you put SP equals none. Our stance is that SP equals none is never appropriate. If you want to if you want to set a specific policy for a subdomain, you can actually do that, and you can actually whitelist subdomains explicitly, but you never want to just blankly say all my subdomains should not be enforced.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, we did see in our data on that second major bullet there a number of sites, especially retailers, that were using the P equals none with no feedback reporting. So that effectively is a non-valid DMARC record. It really doesn't do anything, right? It's just sitting there. Mike, maybe you can, if you can just wrap up those bottom three kind of very quickly, summarize them all together as a common mistake, and we'll move on to the next couple of slides because I want to make sure we get to the end here.
Yeah, you bet. So the next two are both about the reporting addresses, and it kind of sums up as you need to make sure you're publishing a valid email address that can receive the reports. If not, then you're going to have problems. And there's also, in the spec, it says that the domain of the reporting address must match the domain that the record's for. And if not, there's a mechanism to allow for that, but you need to, I won't go into the details here, but you need to pay attention to the spec. So if I publish a record for foo.com and my reporting address goes to email@bar.com, I need to publish another record to allow that to work. And then multiple addresses are also allowed by the spec, but different DMARC reporters will handle them in different ways. Usually for RUA, it's okay. For several, for RUF, we've seen where if you have more than one, some reporters have trouble evaluating multiple RUF addresses, so be careful of that as well. And then finally, just once you publish your record, assuming you get everything right, you're going to start receiving a lot of data, and you need to know what you're going to do with that. So that's probably the most important thing is, do I have a way to parse the reports when I get them? Do I know what my plan is for storing the data and evaluating the data and making some actionable intelligence out of the data that's coming in? Because otherwise it's just a pile of data. So that's probably the most important thing out of all of this.
Great. So you got to get it right, but then you got to be able to use the data. It's a really good point. So let's move on to the next slide. And there are some other considerations here. I'd like to go through these very quickly, maybe just a brief comment on the issue of each of these bullets. Robert, can you take the first two there?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for every one security person I know who cares about protecting their brand in the consumer email world, I can find 100,000 that care about protecting the email channel into the enterprise. That is what has cost the business email compromise has cost businesses $2.3 billion in the last 2 years. Now, why does email authentication have a role to play in this? Because at the core of business email compromise is identity deception. And you solve identity deception through identity authentication. And what's great is that we have already seen significant inroads in adoption of these core authentication technologies that we've talked about on the enterprise gateways. Of course, Office 365 is underpinned by Outlook.com filtering technologies, and Microsoft were great pioneers of DMARC. Same goes for, of course, Google Apps for Work. It's underpinned by the same filtering technology as Gmail.com, which, of course, they were key pioneers of DMARC. So the good news is that as we look into the future, these email authentication techniques and technologies will serve to solve a big problem. That's great, obviously, for protecting enterprises, and that's great because it'll drive greater authentication adoption. Did you want me to just touch on the second one, which is a little bit of, do you want fries with that? or was that going to somebody else, Jeff?
Yeah, you can go ahead and touch on it very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, a no-brainer is that every corporation will have their core domains, their crown jewel domains, but they'll also have a whole host of defensive registrations. Really easy to do a quick audit of that and publish a reject policy to gain incremental protection.
Yeah, you just don't want to leave those open for people to abuse, right? So, Mike, can you take the next one, just dealing with third parties? Notice in your record you point to a lot of third parties, so it's not necessarily always under your control.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's almost unheard of to find an organization of any size or complexity that doesn't use at least one third party to send email. And when you want to authenticate your email and publish a DMARC policy, you have to understand that you're going to need to work with your third party senders to make sure they are authenticating in a way that's in line with your policies. The biggest factor there is usually alignment, like getting the identities that the third parties authenticate to align with your brand, your domain. So that's always a challenge. It's usually the biggest challenge for a complex organization in getting to reject. So that's something to be aware of, and it needs to be part of your project plan when you launch into it.
Great. And Alex, those next two, managing changes and the low volume, you touch quickly on those.
Sure. So managing changes, when you go into a monitoring mode with DMARC, there are many changes that need to be done in order to create this whitelist. Mike touched upon third parties. There's also maybe some internal servers that might be sending email on your behalf, etc. Those changes require changes most times in DNS. In our case, we do it in our own console, which reduces a lot of the management change overhead. But if you don't use a system like ours, you do end up having to make changes in DNS, which requires many different steps. And changing DNS generally is highly guarded, so it does require quite a bit of involvement by both the vendor, DMARC vendor, as well as the actual sender to make multiple changes. And again, those changes aren't immediately obvious as whether they're correct or not. And then quickly going to the next one, what we've seen is a lot of people state, well, 99% of my email is authenticating properly, so it's time to go to enforcement. And that's a volumetric approach to email authentication. We think that that may not be the best way to view this, because one email from your CEO to the lawyer for an acquisition, as I mentioned earlier, may be more important than the tens of thousands of marketing messages you're about to send out. What we believe is really important is to look at services and make sure the services are authenticating properly. Obviously, volumetric measures are interesting to look at, but you really want to look at the senders that you have. Make sure you have all the senders and aren't missing one that may only send an email once a month, because guess what? That may be your invoicing email, which you certainly want to make sure it goes out properly. And we see a lot of people missing these smaller services when they go to enforcement and then cause themselves a lot of headaches later on.
Great. And then Mike, can you touch on that last one? That's probably a key thing, is just to monitor this on an ongoing basis. It's not a once and done kind of thing.
Yeah, some companies feel like once they get a domain to reject, they're done and they can quit paying attention, but that's absolutely not true. In fact, it's important to pay even more attention once you get to reject, because things change. Authentication can break, servers can get added, third parties can get added, and the folks adding these services may not tell you about it when it happens. So you want to keep watching and monitoring that DMARC data on an ongoing basis so you can see those changes and make sure legitimate mail keeps on flowing. That's critically important once you get to reject, that you continue to monitor what's happening.
Right. So this next slide is kind of a call to action. What should you do next given all this information? And rather than kind of go through it bullet by bullet, I'll just kind of briefly summarize it. And I know we're at the top of the hour, so we're probably going to lose some people, but we can leave the line open for some Q&A after I wrap up this slide. So the first thing you need to do is self-assess. You know, what are all your domains? Who are the stakeholders? This goes to the organizational disconnects and who are the owners and so forth. There's a lot of ways to get help out there. You've got your experts on the phone here. OTA has a bunch of resources. We have a summary slide in this deck that kind of references those. If necessary, you might need to build a business case. Why would I want to do this? Is it going to protect me from spear phishing, as has been alluded to? Is it going to help my deliverability? Those kind of things. And you heard about some of the value propositions earlier. And then finally, you need to implement and then put these ongoing processes in place, because as Mike mentioned, it's not a once and done. You kind of need, and you heard through those common mistakes, it requires continued diligence. So whether you do that yourself or use a vendor to kind of manage that for you, it's a very important thing. So maybe we can move to some questions now. And Craig, I think you had some come in that maybe we can address.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff and team, a great job, very insightful, and I learned a lot today as usual here. But I have a series of questions, and we're going to try to go through these. So if you're not able to hang on the webinar, they will be recorded here. A few questions first on SPF, and you know, one of them that I came up a few times is I'm only doing SPF and doing DMARC. Does that provide me any advantages, or what's the downside of only doing SPF with DMARC? And assuming DMARC with a reject met, is that a good idea?
So this is Alex. I would say it's not a good idea to only do SPF. In some cases, for instance, Workday doesn't do DKIM. You have no option. But by having both SPF and DKIM, you have a fallback mechanism where you have redundancy built into your authentication, so that if one fails, and there's many reasons why SPF or DKIM could individually fail on a message, the other one is there to kind of catch that failure and be able to still authenticate a message properly. So I'd say you'd want to do both, but you can't always do both in all cases.
So maybe to ask a clarifying point, and maybe Robert or Mike could add this. So in the case of just SPF, would you advise against doing a DMARC reject policy or quarantine, and assuming that for like your outbound MTA does not support DKIM at this time?
Well, I think that
you go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sorry, Rob. The nice thing about DMARC is you have visibility that allows you to make that decision, right? I don't think it's always cut and dried. I think in some mail flows for some domains, depending on the characteristics of the flow and the percentages of SPF passes, aligned SPF passes you have, you may want to, it may be acceptable to you to go to DMARC reject based on the SPF authentication only. In other cases, that may not be possible. If you have a mail flow that has a lot of forwarding, for example, that causes SPF failures, it may be too high of a percentage that's failing to be acceptable to go to DMARC reject. But you can see that in the DMARC data. That's the beauty of DMARC. Great.
This question, maybe I'll point it to Robert here, because I think it touches on some of the things you talk about. Our email guys have got it great. We got great vendor support, but we can't seem to get the corporate guys to care, or they don't think it's their problem because it's email is working right. You know, what advice do you have to kind of, I guess, cross that chasm from the email marketing team that are focused on deliverability versus the brand protection side of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of levers that you could pull, which speaks to what Mike was talking about, you know, trying to articulate the value. First up, for those people who care about revenue, if you're not authenticating correctly, you stand a greater chance of being filtered out or put in spam, or in the case of Gmail, if you don't pass authentication, either SPF or DKIM, your email will get served up with a red question mark next to the sender identity. That's not great for engagement. So I think there are some levers that you can pull on the revenue side, but on the risk and cost side, you know, we're seeing more and more organizations realize that whilst they haven't been hit with business email compromise yet, or hopefully they haven't, they could be next. And the bad guys in that regard don't just target the big brands. They might target the smaller enterprises who have greater kind of vulnerabilities in their accounts payable team, for example. And it's an insurance policy in that regard. So I think there are a few levers that can be pulled that say, it comes back to my point earlier that ultimately authentication will be implemented, because it's really difficult to conduct this kind of border control without checking people's passports, without checking that people really are who they say they are. That is borne out in the numbers from the FBI, the 2.3 billion of business email compromise impact. And it's also borne out in the numbers that Jeff alluded to earlier from the APWG, talking about 250% rise in consumer phishing. This is an old problem that's only getting worse.
Well, great. We have time for just a few more questions. One question that's kind of come up, and I think Mike Jones, you alluded to it, is the SPF limit of 10 lookups. And what's to stop making that change? Is that a technical requirement? Is it a technical issue, or is it just a concern of the impact to the DNS? And should that be changed?
So whether it should be changed or not, I mean, I think that's a matter of opinion, and I think that's probably been discussed a lot in the SPF working group over the years. It's actually that limitation in the SPF spec has been around, I believe, since the beginning of SPF back in the early to mid 2000s. But I do believe the original intent of that was to avoid putting too much pressure on the DNS infrastructure because it's possible to have a record that just includes an enormous amount of DNS lookups, which would be required to be evaluated every time a message for that domain is received, and that could definitely put pressure on DNS infrastructure.
Oh, great. And you're right, that specification was part of the original, and the concern was the unknown. And obviously we've learned a lot over the past 10 years on the real issues versus, edge cases there. One last question.
Craig, we had,
go ahead.
Yeah, this is Jeff. We just had one question kind of come in the last couple of minutes, as I think it's a very good one. How do I combat threats spoofing my brand sent from domains I don't own? So we've been talking about protecting your own domains, but if someone's pretending to be you, how do you find out about that, and what can you do about it using the mechanisms that we've talked about?
The short answer is the mechanisms that we've talked about do not provide for that. DMARC is domain-based message authentication, and the prerequisite is that you must own the domain in question. For typo, homographic kind of variations of the brand that you own, also great. Publish a DMARC record and you will find and block those types of attacks. Beyond that, so display name spoofing, for example, or other obfuscated domains, you need to put threat intelligence to good work. So you need to cast a net beyond DMARC to find those additional threats and push them through to your shutdown activities as quickly as possible. So yeah, email authentication definitely has its limitations. There are some areas where I think we can evolve, but right now these techniques do not solve for that.
And this is Alex. I would say one other thing. DMARC acts very much, email authentication in general, acts very much like a vaccine. And so what you do is you're vaccinating yourself against the people abusing the domains you own. Now, if someone else does it for their domain, you gain that immunity, so to speak. And so what you're going to see as DMARC adoption increases, you're going to see more and more of the herd immunity take over, where you get to a point, once we're at 70% plus that people are protecting their domains through DMARC, it essentially takes care of the problem in and of itself, because it makes it so that a criminal gets a very low return on investment in trying to spoof domains, because 70% of the domains, and generally the most valuable ones, are now protected. And you gain that protection through other people having protected their domains. So this is definitely something that will get better over time, not worse. I do think it's something that people should keep in mind, and that's why you want a layered approach with SEGs and email authentication, etc.
Yeah, and when the DMARC group originally formed to create the DMARC specification, there was not a lack of awareness of the problems of cousin domains and display name spoofing. It was just the group decided to focus on a specific problem that actually was the preferred method of phishers for spoofing a brand, and that was spoofing the exact domain of that brand. That is the most effective way for a phisher to fool a email recipient. So let's stop that problem, because that's something that the domain owner can control, and recognizing that that's not the only problem out there. It's kind of like if you leave the house I'm going to close the front door and lock it. That doesn't mean a bad guy can't break in through my window, but why should I leave my front door standing up and leave him the easiest and most effective way into my house? Let's make it harder for him, right? If you block off the most effective way for the criminals to act, that's a victory for you.
Well, great. Well, I'm afraid we're all out of time. We're great dialogue. I do see there's some additional questions. We will try to respond to those questions offline. If you have additional questions, you can contact us at the information here, our Agari, return Path and ValiMail, there's resources available. We'll have this posted. And again, I want to thank you everyone for your participation today. Thank the panel for a fantastic job and really for helping make the internet and email safer and more trustworthy. Thank you.